Hello, today we're going to start talking about agriculture, which is a really important part of land use, and this is going to go along mostly with chapter 18 in your book. Now, one thing I wanted to mention before we start is that some of you have just been copying down the words from the slides, and that's really not the best practice. In a lot of classes in college, what you're going to get is basically a copy of the PowerPoint ahead of time. So copying down what's on the slides might be a complete waste of time in that kind of case. But what you really need to pay attention for are all the ways that the instructor is explaining it, all the different examples they're giving, and things like that. So it's important that in these lectures you kind of model the same process and make sure that you're taking the information that's being given not just through the visuals but also through the oral delivery, and then you're taking that and putting it into your own words, abbreviating it so that you can write it quicker, also making it so that you really understand what's going on. And it helps a lot to use things like highlighters, different colored pens, to help when you go back and study kind of differentiate between the different things that you're talking about. So today I'm just going to keep a lot of the text off of the slides that you do need to write down, and I need you to make sure, especially if it's a word that's in purple that's a vocab word, you need to make sure these are things that you know. Alright, so let's start talking about different types of agricultural land use. So we really can only use land that is called arable to be farmed. So arable really just means it's capable of growing crops. So not all ecosystems are going to have arable land in them, and you can see some different types of food production land, cropland in the US in this map here. So out of that arable land, we also have what we call prime farmland. So that would be land that has the soil type, the growing conditions, the available water that you need to produce food. And certain areas of the country are going to have more prime farmland than others. So for example, 90% of the Corn Belt, which is right around here, in this Midwest region, this is going to be 90% prime farmland. And that's why this is kind of called the breadbasket of the US. It's where most of our crops are grown. Now, just because it is prime farmland does not mean that it's all used to grow crops. About a third of that will contain things like roads, pastures, rangelands, forests, feedlots, and farm buildings. And then there are a couple other distinctions that are important here. Cropland is when we're talking generally about plant crops such as soy, corn, things like that. And generally you are plowing this area in order to grow those. Although not always, there are different techniques. Then there's two other distinctions here, rangeland versus pasture. These are both ways that they raise grazing animals like cows or sheep or anything that is going to be grazing on grass for a long period of time. So rangeland is basically the more wild version of that. This is an area that does not need to be grazed, does not need to be plowed and planted in order to provide that forage for these animals, whereas pastures are purposely managed and they plant this hay and these different grasses for the forage for these animals. So this map shows you worldwide some different ecosystems that we might be able to find some of this arable land and this pasture in. And you can see that there are some areas that are just non-productive areas where you're not going to be able to grow food in the first place. If we look at the trend of what's happening over time, you'll see that croplands are actually being reduced as time goes on. And this is mostly due to development and things like that, but that means that we need to find other areas to grow food, or we need to be more efficient in the way that we grow food. So this shows you in the US where we are growing some of these different crops or different versions of livestock, and you can see the different belts we have where different things are primarily grown here. If you do look at arable land in the US, you see that it only makes up about 57%, maybe 56%, and out of that, not all of that is entirely farmland either. A lot of it could be considered marginal cropland, so that's not it's not prime farmland. It's land that you could repurpose for growing crops, but it's not a place that you would necessarily think about growing crops in the first place. And then that remaining 42% is arable land. And again, just like the worldwide trend, one of the things that we're seeing happening here is we're starting to lose agricultural land throughout the United States. And you can see that the red areas and the orange areas are the areas that we're losing the most of that arable land. Now, losing that arable land is a big problem because this agriculture is basically the biggest way that we're using our resources on Earth. So these food resources are very important, and we need to have enough food so that our citizens have what we call food security, which is basically everybody has access to having enough different types of food that they can live a healthy, active lifestyle. Now, we know that not everybody worldwide does have food security. Some are not able to meet their basic needs and they are starving, or others may have enough food but they're not getting the right nutrients, so that would be a case of malnutrition. So if you look at human nutritional requirements, they're much like the nutritional requirements of any other organism. You need large amounts of macronutrients, and these come down to those three major groups of macromolecules that you talked about in biology: protein, carbohydrates, and lipids. And you need a certain amount of each of those daily. You also need a large amount of water daily, so that would also be considered a macronutrient. You need smaller amounts of what we call micronutrients, so those are basically your vitamins and your minerals. Vitamins are usually given a letter name, whereas minerals you can find on the periodic table. These are single elements. And there's lots of different ways that you can show how these should be put together, and different countries come up with different systems to show people how to eat a balanced diet that's going to give them all of these macro and micronutrients. But you can see that carbohydrates in most countries makes up the largest portion, followed by proteins, and then you should limit the amount of fats that you're taking in. So there's a couple terms that are related to this that we should understand. The first is this idea of yield. So when we're talking about crops, the yield is basically how much of that particular crop we're going to produce. So if you yield 200 bushels of corn, that's how much you were able to grow and make successfully. And the yield is always determined by a limiting factor or limiting nutrient. So one of those nutrients that we talked about, for instance, one of those vitamins or minerals, could be limiting the growth of a particular organism. And that's going to mean that if you don't have enough of that mineral, say in this case, in this picture, it's potassium, then you can't grow above a certain amount of that crop. So all crops depend on having a certain amount of each of these nutrients that they need in order to produce their maximum yield. So one thing that farmers are going to try to do is provide all of these nutrients to their crops so that they get the highest yield possible. This also comes into play in things like algae blooms. Remember, with eutrophication, you're having this huge algae bloom because of the extra nutrients in the water. Well, one of the reasons for that is because there's so many nutrients in the water. If we cut those nutrients down, even if we only cut one of them, that's going to limit the amount of algae that can bloom, which is going to eliminate that dead zone. There are also some synergistic effects between these nutrients. Basically, that means that these nutrients rely on each other to work. So for a lot of vitamins, you need certain minerals in order for the vitamin to do its job in the body. So these synergistic effects are going to basically show that when you change one nutrient that an organism gets, it can also it can change the way they absorb other nutrients. And one of the things that we've seen with this in humans is that calcium and vitamin C work very closely together. So if you're not getting enough of one, you might not be getting the full effects of either of those things. So let's go back to humans for a second and think about what happens when we don't get enough of the right nutrients or not enough nutrients overall. So either way, this is called malnutrition, and there's two kind of divisions there. There's undernourished versus malnourished, and there's also a condition called overnourished. So if you're undernourished, you just don't get enough calories, period. You don't have enough food to survive at your current weight. If you're malnourished, it's a little bit different because you're just not getting the right nutrients. So you might be getting enough food, but you're not getting everything that you need to get. So worldwide, if you look at all of this together, undernourished and malnourished, the UN estimates that at least 1 billion people are malnourished. So that's a significant part of our population, and we need a lot of money in order to basically fix that. If you look at where those undernourished people are, you see that most of them are in those developing countries. So again, we see this pattern where a large portion of Africa and Asia are these countries that are most at risk for this. And if you also start to look at the amount of energy that are provided by different types of food, you can start to see where some of these calorie deficits might be coming from. So these are basically energy amounts that are provided by different staple crops that are eaten in large amounts throughout the world. And you can see that at the top here, these are all measured in kilojoules. You're probably more familiar with the unit of calories. So up here you have your conversion factors, how to get back and forth between them. But just for example, if you look at cassava, you're getting a very high output in terms of energy for growing a square meter of cassava. So think of a meter stick, that squared. You're getting what works out here to be about 2,000 calories per square meter. Whereas something like soybeans, you're only getting about 352 calories per square meter. And unfortunately, a lot of the very common staple crops fall a little bit lower on this energy scale. So if you look worldwide at the daily calories per capita, you see again those developing countries are the ones that are getting the least calories and are the most likely to be undernourished, whereas the highly developed countries are getting, in many cases, too many calories per day per person. And in this particular chart, what you're seeing here is the amount of household income that is spent on food. And you can see that in these highly developing countries, again, we don't spend as much on our food. It is around 20% of our total income. Whereas in a lot of these developing countries, that is most of your income going towards getting food. So that may be part of the reason why you're undernourished. Also, with malnutrition comes a lot of different types of diseases. So goiter is one particular example. If you don't get enough iodine, your thyroid gland can enlarge significantly, and that can cause other problems that ripple throughout your body. Famine in general, when you're starving, that could be caused by lots of different things, but you're not going to be getting enough nutrients. So this is going to happen more in those areas that are being affected by natural disaster and war, and again, it tends to be those developing countries. So if you look at the percentage of the population that's undernourished throughout the world, again, you see the same patterns over and over. And just like before, we see this pattern happening mostly in those countries with the highest population, including lots of the countries in Africa. And that's why a lot of these factors collide and you wind up with a lot of unrest in these areas. So a couple diseases that children can get if they are malnourished are listed here. And you can see that gives them that bloated belly effect that you see in a lot of starving children. Even though they don't have enough to eat, you wind up with that bloated belly. So there are some solutions to childhood hunger, and they tend to be the same solutions that result in higher education in women and better birth control and lower populations in general. So you should see a lot of overlap here. Now, overnutrition is also possible, and that's the exact opposite of undernutrition. So this is something much more common in highly developed countries where we eat too much, or in addition, maybe lack exercise in order to burn off those calories. And that can also result in quite a bit of damage to your body as well. One of the kind of ironic things here is, remember we said about $24 billion would be what it would take to cure world hunger. If you look at the amount of money that Americans spend per year to lose weight, that kind of puts that into perspective. So moving forward, one of the things that we want to focus on is how are these agricultural ecosystems different from our natural ecosystems? So there's some major ways here. First of all, the agricultural ecosystems are trying to stop succession in an early stage, so usually in that meadow stage so that they can grow crops, although there are some types of agriculture that will grow them inside of the forest, and then it could be a little bit later. They tend to be monocultures, so you're only growing one species at a time or one species in a certain area. So that's going to really simplify your biological diversity. It's going to lower your biodiversity. And the crops are also planted in nice, neat rows. Organisms don't really like to live in nice, neat patterns. So that's going to take away a lot of those natural parts of the ecosystem. And then plowing really disturbs the soil and mixes things up in a way that wouldn't happen naturally. Additionally, we're going to talk about this unit, how crops have been genetically modified, and that can also impact the ecosystem. probably the largest impact that farming has, however, is on those natural cycles like the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus, and so on. Because normally there's a certain balance in the cycle, when you start trying to grow crops and you need to add all of these nutrients back in, if you're not doing it in the exact same balance that nature has, now you're throwing off that natural cycle. You have more nitrogen or more carbon in a certain area than you would normally. And we can see some of the impacts that we get from that, and we'll look at those later on. It's important to notice, though, that croplands are not always bad. Agriculture also benefits the environment in several ways. So here are some ecological services and also some economic services, which might be the more obvious ones. It provides us with food and jobs. It also helps to maintain water flow, allows the soil to infiltrate that water and soak it in and replenish the groundwater. It provides protection from erosion with those roots holding everything in. It helps to build the organic matter in the soil as those crops decay. Even adding fertilizer can put nutrients in places where it wasn't before. It also helps as a sink for that atmospheric carbon, because all of that carbon that those plants are taking in becomes part of their bodies. And then it can provide wildlife habitat for some species, although it does tend to be limited compared to the natural habitat. So when we talk about agriculture, there's two principal types that you need to know about. There's the more of the traditional type, which is a low input polyculture, and then there's the more modern type, which is the industrialized high input monoculture. So the traditional farming practices are still practiced in developing countries, and many of these practices are still happening on family farms in the highly developed countries as well. And this would include things like subsistence agriculture, which is basically when you just grow enough food for your family to survive. You might from year to year have a little bit extra food that you can sell, but for the most part you're just trying to provide food for your own family. That's subsistence. And a lot of these other types under here kind of fall under subsistence agriculture. So shifting cultivation is a form of subsistence agriculture where you're using short periods of cultivation in certain areas, followed by longer fallow periods where you kind of left the land alone and it can go back to forest again. So in shifting cultivation, you're farming it, you're letting it go back to its natural ecosystem, you're farming it again. Slash and burn agriculture, we've talked about a little bit already in clearing forests. It can be very destructive to the ecosystem. Basically, you're taking an area that would probably be tropical forest and you're clearing it in order to plant crops. And then that uses up the nutrients in the soil very quickly, much more than that natural ecosystem would. So a lot of times these farms become abandoned, but then the area may become a little bit desertified at that point because the nutrients aren't there to produce this tropical forest anymore. And then you have nomadic herding. In that case, your livestock is being herded around. You continually move them to place so that you can get enough food. This is very common in areas that don't have enough productivity or enough grazing plants in order to support a livestock population permanently. So instead of keeping your cows on one tract of land, you have to keep moving them around to get them enough food. So we see these types of low input polycultures happening mostly in those developing countries. What we're moving towards at this point is more of an industrialized high input type of agriculture that gives us much higher yields. So that allows us to feed many more people. But it does require a large amount of money to start up, and it also requires a lot of energy to run, and that energy usually comes from fossil fuels. And it requires so much energy because it's done on such a large scale that machinery is required to basically plant, harvest, and do every step along the way, including irrigating the crops. And also, in addition, we're using these agrochemicals like pesticides and herbicides, and it takes energy to make those in the first place. So when you really start to look at all of the inputs here, you see that a huge amount of them cost money and take other resources from areas where you're not even actually performing the agriculture. And they're still using that same idea, with photosynthesis being the major part that begins our food chain here, but they're taking a lot more energy to do so. And if you start to look at where this is happening around the world, you see that we are having more and more industrialized agriculture in these highly developed countries, and less of that more traditional type of agriculture, which doesn't produce as high yields. So if we go back and we look more at this traditional agriculture again, there's some different types that you should know about. So polyvarietal cultivation just means that you're planting several different varieties of things at once. So instead of just planting one type of corn, maybe you plant many types of corn in an area, and that genetic variety helps increase your biodiversity. Intercropping is when you're growing two or more crops at the same time in a particular area. So you'll see this sometimes where you have strips of corn going through strips of trees that are being harvested, different things like that. This could also be considered agroforestry whenever you're growing a crop and a tree together. Agroforestry gets used a lot in rainforests to grow things like coffee and rubber because they can grow in that lower canopy of the rainforest. And then polycultures in general are whenever we're talking about different plants being planted together or different organisms in general. And research shows that on average, this low input polyculture actually produces higher yields than high input monoculture if it's done efficiently and if it's done with a plan in mind. So this approach basically came out of what we call the Green Revolution in the 1950s and 60s. So this is when our world population started to really take off, and there was a lot of stress on the food supply as a result. And basically what happened is scientists developed lots of new high yield varieties so that you could produce more food in less space. It would be more nutritious, more able to withstand things like drought and salty soils and things like that that might prevent you from growing crops traditionally. But the downside of these new varieties is that you really have to be intensely involved in their production, and it takes a lot of chemicals and machinery to make sure that they produce your high yield. So this started in those developed countries like us and like those European countries, and then it kind of spread into our developing countries like, for instance, Mexico. And there were lots of different changes as a result of this. But overall, it allowed us to make more food. But there were those downsides again as well, as it cost more money. It took more water. It took more of these different resources. And that means that it kind of shuts out some of those smaller family farm type industries. So one of its great successes is we've produced much more food. However, if you actually look at the amount of food we're producing per capita or per person, you see that it stayed somewhat the same. But our population has grown so much that that's not so surprising because we're just basically keeping up with the amount of food we need to support that population. So far, the major improvements in farm production have come from technological advances and also genetic modification of a few well-known species. The increase in yield has been spectacular. You can see how much it's increased in different areas. A century ago, when all corn in the U.S. was open pollinated, average yields were only about 25 bushels per acre. In 1999, the average yields from hybrid corn were around 130 bushels per acre. So, and even under optimum conditions, you could get up to 250 bushels per acre, so literally 10 times the amount we were growing. And most of that gain was accomplished by conventional plant breeding, not genetic modification. So geneticists doing things like hand pollinating plants and moving selected genes from one variety to another in order to produce a plant that's going to have a higher yield. And it has helped our overall malnourished population to start to decline. However, this green revolution has also had a large environmental impact. And part of that is that in places where you have a lack of water, you have to find a way to irrigate these fields. You also have very high costs for small farmers, and you also only have a certain amount of land you can grow this food on. So since 1998, the amount of irrigated land that's actually used to produce crops per person has declined due to all of these different things, including things that we've talked about already, such as groundwater depletion and soil salinization. And overall, when you look at modern agriculture and what it does to the environment, you see that it has a much larger impact than any other human activity so far. It can impact our environment in so many different ways, many of which you can see here. and that's mostly what we're going to talk about this unit. So one of these reasons is because of the amount of fossil fuels that you're using. You're adding a tremendous amount of CO2 to the atmosphere. You're also increasingly using greenhouses more and more and more, or large plantations, and these create monocultures, and in cases like greenhouses, you're developing that land essentially too, so you're taking it away from the natural environment, and you can see the results that that can have with your own eyes. Also, since these are monocultures, sometimes what is done with livestock is they're using these feedlots essentially to grow massive amounts of livestock in a certain area. So cattle, pigs, chickens, things like that. And these feedlot systems use tremendous amounts of energy and water, and they produce a tremendous amount of sewage of animal waste that we have to have a way to deal with. So at this point, only about half the world's meat is produced by livestock that's actually grazing on grass, and the other half is produced under factory-like conditions, like these feedlots. And chances are most of the meat that you're getting at the grocery store is coming from one of these places. So these livestock are packed in very tightly. They're fed things like grain or fish meal instead of grass, and they are going to produce a more significant impact on the environment. So one of the reasons for this is that we are growing a tremendous amount of grain in order to feed these animals. And that grain, if we were just eating it ourselves, would produce a lot more energy for humans directly. Additionally, we get all of the extra negative benefits that kind of goes along with growing that grain in the first place. Like, we need to use a significant amount more energy if we're going to grow grain in order to feed cows instead of just growing grain to feed ourselves. If you actually calculated it out, it's about a 10-to-1 ratio, 10 units of fossil fuels needed for 1 unit of food. So that's a tremendous amount, and it winds up being about 17% of all commercial energy used in the US. Also, keep in mind that once we raise this livestock, it's also got to get to your plate. So it's got to travel from the feedlot to the processing plant to your supermarket and to your home. And this uses a tremendous amount of fossil fuels as well. Now, when we look at the feedlots themselves, they have some significant environmental impacts. And you can probably imagine a lot of these just from kind of looking at the setup and the areas that they're in. But some of the major potential problems that we run into are things like using hormone supplements. Well, are these hormones safe for human use? Are they things that could impact our health? And the jury is still out on that. So far, they have not found any human health effects from using these growth hormones and things to produce more meat, but they still haven't had enough time to really be sure of that. So a lot of people are still concerned about that. Also, this leads to higher rates of encephalopathies. When you have animals housed all together in a very crowded area like this, you have higher rates of things like mad cow's disease, especially if they are feeding them with bone meal from other organisms of the same species. So a lot of times what will happen is cow bones may get ground up and fed to the cows, and that's essentially a form of cannibalism. And one of the things that can develop as a result of this is something called a prion, which is a protein that can actually change itself around and infect different areas of the cow. And that's basically the cause of mad cow's disease. And we see different types of these encephalopathies happening in different organisms. They're pretty much always caused by the same thing. There's some sort of infected part of the animal that is eaten, and then that causes this, you can kind of think of it as a protein virus, even though it's not technically a virus, which will infect the rest of the organism and can in many cases jump to humans and make us very sick as well. Another problem is you get very high levels of infectious disease. They're packed in on top of each other. If one organism gets sick, it's very likely that a whole group of them will. In addition, they're fed a huge amount of antibiotics in order to try to prevent some of these infectious diseases from spreading. So if you look at the antibiotics produced in the US, actually 80% of them are used on factory farm animals. So that's a huge amount of what we make every year. And that's a problem because that's going to increase the amount of antibiotic resistance in that bacterial population. The more antibiotics are out there, the more bacteria are going to be able to survive those antibiotics. So even if it does help keep an infection under control in that particular feedlot, it's still a danger that that bacteria now, if it happens to survive in the animal's gut and somehow makes it into your food, that bacteria could then make you very sick and none of the antibiotics might work in order to cure it. So you will see ads like this that tell people that, these antibiotics are safe and they're not going to wind up in your body eventually. And while that might be true, that still means that you're still increasing the level of antibiotic resistance in the overall bacteria population, even if that antibiotic doesn't make it to you. This is just an example of some of those hormones. And so far, the data does come back that even these beef cows and other animals that are getting these hormones, probably these hormones might not have an effect on you because they're in such low levels. But again, we need further testing to be sure of that. One of the things that I mentioned that we have a problem with feedlots is the amount of animal waste that gets produced as part of this. And just for one particular example of this, if we look at Hurricane Floyd, which came into North Carolina in 1999, all of that animal waste in those feedlots there were stored in these lagoons. And then you get something like a flooding event, that floods the lagoon, you have all those nutrients now that are going to go into the groundwater, cause things like eutrophication, cause the spread of pathogens and things like that. So that's another issue associated with this type of raising livestock. Now, there are advantages, there are disadvantages to them. So take a second and write some of those down. Obviously, it allows us to produce a lot more meat for a lot more people, but there are trade-offs. So the last thing I'd like to leave you with here is a look at how some of our natural resources are affected by agriculture, and this helps to kind of recap a lot of the stuff we've been talking about today. So I'd like you to write down some of these negative impacts that we have in various different parts of the environment here. According to a 2002 study by the UN, nearly 30% of the world's cropland has been degraded to some degree just by soil erosion and salt buildup alone. Also, chemical pollution comes into that in terms of pesticides, which we're going to talk about later. 17% of the world's cropland has been seriously degraded to the point that you cannot use it to grow crops anymore. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about agriculture is we want it to be a sustainable system. We want to keep using it to grow food for many generations to come, and that means that we need to take care of it when we're doing so. So that's what our next couple parts of this unit are going to be about, is how do we maintain this land and how do we provide these food resources without creating such damage to the environment and to the cropland itself that it's no longer usable. Alright, so we'll leave off there and then we'll pick up next time talking about some of those best practices to ensure that we can use this for generations to come.